Find out by liking this video, commenting what you think will happen, sharing with your friends and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue telling these Wild West stories. Snow fell like tears from an ashen sky as Aurora Mendez contemplated once again the portrait hanging beside the fireplace. 3 winters had passed since Sebastian had departed forever, victim of that unfortunate encounter with bandits on the road to town. 3 winters of gazes lost in the crackling fire, and hands clutching the old rifle that now rested by the door, a silent sentinel of her solitude. The wooden cabin stood defiant atop the hills of Sierra Madre, a place where the wind whistled. Forgotten stories, and where Aurora, at 25, had built an impenetrable refuge, not only against the cold, but against the unwelcome compassion she so detested. Time heals all wounds, the parish priest had told her at the funeral. But time, Aurora thought as she stoked the embers of the fireplace, only teaches one to live with the scars. The woman's fingers, hardened by daily work, unconsciously caressed the ring she still wore on her left hand. The day's last light filtered through the fogged windows, drawing ghostly figures on the wooden walls. Outside, the storm raged with unusual fury, as if the mountain itself wanted to uproot that lonely cabin. Aurora poured herself some bitter coffee and observed through the window how the snowflakes swirled in a frantic dance. It was then that she heard it. A weak knock, almost imperceptible, on the door. Then another, and yet another, her body tensed like a bowstring. Nobody climbed the hills during a storm like this, much less to her secluded cabin. She took the rifle, with the firmness that comes from years of practice, and walked toward the door with silent steps. Her heart pounded in her throat as she slowly turned the doorknob. The icy wind lashed her face when she opened it, and there, amid the curtain of relentlessly falling snow, she made out the figure of a young man. He couldn't be more than 18. His thin body trembled violently, and his lips, of a disturbing bluish tone, could barely articulate words. His dark eyes, however, spoke with the desperation of someone clinging to a last breath. "Please," murmured the young man, before his legs gave way. Aurora held the rifle firmly, aiming at the stranger who now collapsed on her doorstep. Her mind screamed at her to close the door, that this stranger was a threat to the fortress she had worked so hard to build. But something deeper, something she thought dead long ago, stopped her. In those pleading eyes she had recognized something familiar, the same loneliness that accompanied her every night. The young man lay unconscious on the worn rug before the fireplace. Aurora had hesitated, the rifle still in her hands as he collapsed on the threshold. But something, perhaps a remnant of the woman she was before morning, had compelled her to drag him inside. She removed his soaked clothes with mechanical movements, avoiding looking at him more than necessary. Her hands, accustomed to rough tasks, worked with forgotten delicacy. When she covered him with blankets, she noticed the extreme thinness of his body, the ribs marked under pale skin, old scars that told stories she didn't want to know. The fever made him delirious. Amidst incoherent murmurs, Aurora distinguished fragments. Mom, the epidemic, alone. Broken words that resonated on the cabin walls like echoes of a past that somehow felt painfully familiar to her. The night progressed as she moistened the young man's forehead with a cold cloth. She observed his features in the fluctuating firelight, marked cheekbones, a jawline beginning to define itself, long eyelashes that cast shadows on his sunken cheeks, a face that carried too much for its age. "Mateo," the young man said amid feverish dreams. Aurora startled. For an instant she thought he had awakened, but his eyes remained closed. "Mateo Ibarra," he repeated with more clarity. "It's my name." "Sleep, Mateo," she responded with a voice she didn't recognize as her own, rough from disuse. When the young man's breathing became more regular, Aurora allowed herself to sit in the old rocking chair by the window. Outside, the storm continued, unleashing its fury against the world. Inside, something inexplicable stirred in her chest. The last time she had cared for someone was when Sebastian fell ill with pneumonia, shortly before that fateful journey. The same hands that now prepared compresses had then held her husband's while the fever subsided. The same silent vigil beside the sick. The same lump in her throat. Dawn surprised her asleep in the rocking chair, with the rifle resting against her legs. She awoke with a start, immediately seeking the intruder with her gaze. Mateo remained where she had left him, but his eyes were now open, observing her with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Where?" he tried to ask, but his voice was barely a hoarse whisper. Aurora rose without saying a word and offered him a glass of water. The young man took it with trembling hands, drinking desperately. When he finished, his eyes sought hers again. Aurora nodded, collecting the empty glass. "The storm continues," she commented dryly, like someone talking about the weather with an acquaintance. It wasn't an invitation to stay, but neither was it an order to leave. It was a statement of facts, a neutral way of acknowledging his presence without commitment. "I'll leave as soon as it lets up," he responded, understanding the subtext. Aurora didn't answer. She headed to the small kitchen and began preparing a broth. Her movements were precise, efficient. From the corner of her eye, she observed how the young man struggled to sit up, keeping the blankets around his body. His clothes, which she had spread near the fire, were still not dry. "Do you live alone up here?" asked Mateo after a long silence. The question hung in the air between the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. Aurora stirred the broth with more force than necessary. "Yes," she finally responded, without turning. What she didn't say was that solitude had first been an imposition, then a choice, and finally a refuge. That the walls of that cabin kept memories that hurt and comforted in equal parts. That in that lost corner of the Sierra, she had buried not only her husband, but also the woman she once was. The storm did not abate. For 3 days, the snow continued to fall with almost personal obstinacy, as if the sky itself conspired to keep Mateo under Aurora's roof. 3 days in which both existed in a strange equilibrium, like two wild animals forced to share the same cave. Cautious, always maintaining a prudent distance, Aurora observed how the young man gradually regained strength. The first morning he could barely stand. By the 3rd day he was already moving around the cabin with slow but sure steps. He ate with the voracious appetite of one who has known hunger, though always with an educated restraint that revealed that before his present misery he had known better days. "My father was a teacher in Valle Sereno," he told her during dinner on the 2nd day, when the silence had become too dense. "He died in the epidemic last autumn, along with my mother and my little sister." He said it without drama, with the resignation of one who has repeated the same words so many times that they have lost their edge. Aurora didn't respond immediately. She recognized that way of talking about loss, like a climatic event, something inevitable that simply happens. "Why did you climb the Sierra in this weather?" she finally asked, serving him more stew. Mateo contemplated the plate for a moment before answering. "The new teacher didn't want me around. He said an orphan of the epidemic brought bad luck to the town." Aurora felt something tense inside her. She knew well the superstitious cruelty of small towns. She herself had experienced it when, after Sebastian's death, the whispers began. That the widow lived alone out of pride, that she rejected company out of arrogance, that her isolation was an offense to God. "Ignorance always seeks culprits," she murmured more to herself than to him. Mateo's eyes lit up with a spark of surprise and recognition. For the first time since his arrival, Aurora felt that he truly looked at her, not as his savior or his jailer, but as someone who could understand at ease. Dawn on the 4th day, the storm finally surrendered. The sun peeked timidly between scattered clouds, illuminating a world transformed into immaculate white. Aurora rose early, as always, and looked out the window. Soon Mateo would leave, and she would return to her carefully cultivated solitude. But when she turned, she found him standing by the kitchen door. He no longer wore the borrowed clothes, but his own, now dry and clumsily mended. "I'm leaving," he announced, with a certainty that contradicted the almost imperceptible trembling of his hands. "Thank you for everything." Aurora nodded, feeling a relief that wasn't entirely sincere. Routine would return, and with it, the peace of the predictable. However, when the young man opened the door, something compelled her to speak. "The path will be impassable," she said, pointing toward the window. "The snow covers more than a meter." Matteo stopped, his figure silhouetted against the bright light from outside. Fredson, it doesn't matter. I've abused your hospitality too much. Aurora approached the pantry and took out some provisions, placing them on the table with abrupt movements. At least take these, she offered, avoiding his gaze. And the shed needs repairs. The storm must have damaged the roof. If you want to stay a few more days, you could help me with that. The words had left her mouth before she could stop them, surprising both her and him. Matteo remained motionless, his hand still, on the doorknob, as if evaluating whether this was a genuine offer or mere courtesy. I know how to work with wood, he said finally. My father taught me. Aurora merely nodded again, trying to ignore the strange relief she felt at his response. There are tools in the shed, she indicated, recovering her practical tone. We'll start after breakfast. Thus, without ceremony or grand declarations, the balance between them changed. They were no longer simply two strangers trapped by the storm, but two people who had tacitly agreed to tolerate each other's presence a little longer. What Aurora couldn't know, as she prepared breakfast with mechanical movements, was that this small decision, so pragmatic, so rational in her eyes, would be the first of many steps on a path she had never planned to travel. Matteo's hands had a surprising delicacy for someone so young. Aurora observed him from the window as he worked on the shed roof, measuring, cutting, adjusting each board with the precision of someone who had grown up among books, but also among tools. It wasn't the clumsiness she expected from a teacher's son, but the methodical ability of someone who had learned to fend for himself. My father believed that an educated man should know as much about Cervantes as about carpentry, he explained one afternoon, while hammering the last boards. He said that true wisdom resides both in the mind and in the hands. Aurora nodded, recognizing the wisdom in those words. Sebastian had been different, a man of action more than reflection, brave to the point of recklessness. His hands, always restless, rarely built. They were hands made for hunting, for riding, for protecting. Hands that finally could not defend themselves. The days stretched like the fine thread of a spider's web. The shed was repaired, but something else always appeared. The fence damaged by the weight of snow, the clogged drainage channels, the firewood that needed to be cut and stacked. Small excuses that neither of them acknowledged as such. One morning, Aurora found a small object carved in wood on the table, a hummingbird with outstretched wings, so detailed that it seemed about to take flight. She took it between her fingers, feeling the smoothness of the polished wood. I've seen it hovering around the flowers on the hillside, said Matteo from the doorway, with a shyness that contrasted with his growing confidence in recent days. Although with this cold it must be far away now. Aurora contemplated the small figure. It had been so long since anyone had offered her a gift that she had forgotten how to respond. Gratitude was an atrophied muscle within her. It's beautiful, she finally murmured, and the word sounded strange on her lips, as if she had unearthed a term from another language, one she hadn't used in a long time. Something changed from that day on. Meals, previously silent and functional, began to lengthen. Conversations, previously limited to practical matters, began to drift toward memories, ideas, small confessions delivered with caution. Aurora discovered that Matteo adored adventure books, that he could recognize constellations, that he played the flute, although he hadn't had one in his hands for months. One afternoon, while washing the dishes after a meal, Matteo asked her about the portrait by the fireplace. The question was inevitable, but even so, Aurora felt the air leaving her lungs. My husband, Sebastian, she responded curtly, drying a plate with more force than necessary. I'm sorry, he said, understanding immediately. I didn't mean to. He died 3 years ago, she interrupted him, the words coming out like stones. Dragged by a river. Bandits on the road to town. He was carrying the money from the sale of our livestock. The silence that followed was dense, laden with all the things Aurora didn't say, that she should have gone to town that day, that Sebastian offered because he saw she was tired, that the last image she kept of him was his carefree smile as he mounted his horse. Matteo didn't respond with the platitudes that Aurora had come to hate so much. He didn't say that time would heal, that God had a plan, that Sebastian was in a better place. He simply took the next plate and continued drying it, respecting the weight of what had been shared. That night, for the first time since his arrival, Aurora took Sebastian's old guitar from the closet. It was out of tune, with strings rusted. From disuse, Matteo observed her with astonishment, as if she had just revealed a treasure. "Do you play?" he asked with a smile that lit up his face. Aurora shook her head, caressing the instrument with a familiarity that contradicted her words. Sebastian played. "I only listened." She handed the guitar to Matteo, an offering that went beyond the simple object. The young man took it with reverence, adjusting the pegs with patience, testing each string until finding the correct tuning. And then his fingers began to dance over the strings, drawing out notes that seemed to awaken the sleeping ghosts of the cabin. Aurora closed her eyes. The melody was different from those Sebastian used to play, but there was something in it. Cadence, a feeling that felt painfully familiar to her, as if the music were a bridge between what she had lost and what, without realizing it, she was beginning to find. When she opened her eyes again, she found Matteo's gaze fixed on her. A clean, transparent look, without the pity or intention she had so feared to find in the eyes of others. And for the first time in 3 years, Aurora allowed tears to flow freely down her cheeks. That night, sitting by the fire, with music floating between them like a living being, something began to heal in Aurora's chest, a tiny crack in the armor she had built around her heart, a fissure so small she barely noticed it, but enough for a ray of light to slip into the darkness that had been her refuge for so long. Winter slowly yielded its dominion to a timid spring. The snow began to melt on the slopes most exposed to. The sun and the first green shoots appeared among the waning white. With the thaw, the path to town became passable again, and Aurora knew she would soon need to descend to the valley to stock up. The idea of returning to the world, of facing stares and questions, produced an uneasiness she hadn't felt in a long time. During the past months, the cabin had been a self-sufficient universe, a place where only she and Matteo existed, their shared routines, the slow thawing of their relationship. "We need provisions," she announced one morning, while Matteo repaired a chair by the window. "I'll go down to the town tomorrow." The young man looked up from his work. He had gained weight and color in these months. His cheeks were no longer sunken, and his hands had acquired new calluses different from before. "I'll accompany you," he offered naturally. Aurora felt a knot in her stomach. Since Sebastian's death, her visits to town had been brief and solitary, calculated to minimize contact with others. The idea of showing up with Matteo, of facing curiosity and judgments, filled her with apprehension. "It's not necessary," she responded with more brusqueness than she intended. "I can go alone." Matteo nodded, returning to his work without insisting, but Aurora noticed the shadow that crossed his face, the slight hardening of his jaw. Did he think she was ashamed of him? The idea bothered her more than she expected. "It's just that," she began, looking for words to explain something that even she didn't fully understand. "The town talks. It always talks." "I know," he responded without looking up. "I remember how they talked after the epidemic, as if the dead were guilty of dying." Aurora remembered Matteo's words about the new teacher, about the superstition that had expelled him. She understood then that he understood better than anyone the weight of others' gazes. "All right," she finally conceded. "We can go together." And the next morning dawned clear and bright. They mounted the 2 horses Aurora kept in the stable, hers, a chestnut of calm temperament, and what had been Sebastian's, a strong bay that seemed pleased to have a rider again. The descent toward town was silent. Aurora felt her tension grow with each meter that brought them closer to civilization. Beside her, Matteo rode erect, with a serenity she envied. How strange, she thought, that it was he, so many years younger, who seemed more prepared to face what awaited them. Valle Sereno appeared before them, like a watercolor of red roofs and whitewashed walls, nestled among mountains that still retained snow on their peaks. The first houses on the outskirts were surrounded by small gardens where some women were already working the land. Aurora noticed how they stopped when they saw them pass, how eyes followed their progress, how whispers sprouted like poisonous flowers in their wake. In the main square, they dismounted, The weekly market was in full swing. Stalls of vegetables, meat, fabrics, and tools occupied the space in front of the church. Aurora took a deep breath, preparing for the scrutiny she knew would come. She didn't have to wait long. They had barely approached the first stall, that of Doña Carmen, the cheese vendor, when silence fell over those nearby. The woman who had always been kind to Aurora now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Good morning, Aurora," she greeted, with unusual formality. "It's been a while since you came down." "The winter was harsh," she responded, curtly, pointing to the cheeses she wanted to buy. Doña Carmen's eyes drifted toward Mateo, who waited a step behind. "And your companion?" she asked, with an intonation that loaded the word with insinuations. Aurora felt the blood rising to her face. Before she could respond, Mateo stepped forward and extended his hand toward the woman. "Mateo Ibarra, ma'am," he introduced himself with impeccable courtesy, "son of teacher Ibarra from Valle Sereno. Mrs. Mendez has given me work on her property." The mention of his father seemed to throw Doña Carmen off balance, who took his hand with some hesitation. "Teacher Ibarra, but he died in the epidemic," Mateo completed gently, "along with my mother and my sister." "Yes, ma'am." An uncomfortable silence followed his words. Aurora observed how Doña Carmen's expression changed, softening almost imperceptibly. "I'm very sorry, boy," she finally said. "Your father was a good man." They continued their shopping under the town's attentive gaze. Aurora noticed that Mateo's strategy worked. By introducing himself as the son of the respected teacher, by mentioning his family tragedy, by clearly defining their relationship as employment, he partially disarmed suspicions. Even so, whispers followed them like shadows. It was when leaving the grocery store that the encounter Aurora most feared occurred. Don Francisco Vega, the town's parish priest, crossed their path. The man, about 60 years old and with a severe gaze, had been particularly insistent after Sebastian's death, visiting her in the cabin frequently to watch over her soul and suggesting each time with less subtlety that a young widow should not live alone in the mountains. "Aurora," he greeted with a nod. "What a surprise to finally see you in town. It's been months since you attended Mass." "Good morning, Father," she responded dryly. The priest's eyes rested on Mateo with a disturbing intensity. "And this young man is—" "Mateo Ibarra," the young man intervened again. "I work for Mrs. Mendez." The priest narrowed his eyes, as if evaluating the truthfulness of that statement. "Ibarra? The teacher's son?" His tone became condescending. "I thought you had left the valley after everything that happened." Mateo held his gaze without blinking. "I did, Father. But God guides our steps along unexpected paths, doesn't he?" The response, which used the priest's own language, momentarily disconcerted him. Aurora took advantage of the pause to say goodbye, gently taking Mateo by the arm. "If you'll excuse us, Father, we must return before nightfall." As they walked away, Aurora felt the priest's gaze fixed on their backs like a dagger. "He doesn't like you," she commented in a low voice when they were at a prudent distance. Mateo sketched an ironic smile. "He never liked me," he responded. "Even before the epidemic. He said I asked too many questions in catechism classes." Aurora couldn't help but smile at the image of a younger Mateo challenging the severe priest's authority. It was easy to imagine. The same inquisitive eyes, the same direct way of holding one's gaze. They were about to mount again when a voice stopped them. "Mateo! Mateo Ibarra!" They turned to find a middle-aged man approaching at a quick pace. Aurora didn't recognize him immediately, but by the way Mateo's eyes lit up, she knew he did. "Don Miguel!" exclaimed the young man, stepping forward to shake the man's hand with genuine joy. "Boy, what a joy to see you," responded the man, giving him an affectionate pat on the shoulder. "When you left, I thought, well, we all feared the worst." "I'm fine, Don Miguel," Mateo assured him. "Mrs. Mendez has given me work and lodging when I most needed it." The man turned to Aurora, extending his hand with a frank smile. "Miguel Soto, ma'am. I was a colleague of Mateo's father at the school I teach mathematics." Aurora shook his hand, surprised by the genuine warmth of his greeting. so different from the wary looks they had received all day. Aurora Mendez. She introduced herself, and for the first time in a long time she added, "A pleasure to meet you." They conversed briefly. Don Miguel told them the school was still functioning, although with fewer students since the epidemic. That the new teacher was indeed a rigid and superstitious man. That many in the town missed Mateo's father, his wisdom, his way of teaching. "You should come visit us sometime," he said to Mateo as they parted. "The children still ask about you. They remember when your father brought you to class and you told them stories." Aurora observed how Mateo's face lit up at the invitation, and something stirred within her. During these months she had come to know the young man who shared her roof, but only now did she begin to glimpse the Mateo who existed before, the son of the respected teacher, the storyteller, the young man with a place in the community. Returning. To the cabin, riding along the path that snaked up the mountain, Aurora broke the silence. "Don Miguel seems to appreciate you." Mateo nodded, his gaze lost on the horizon. "He and my father were friends since they were young. After the epidemic, he wanted me to stay with his family, but... The new teacher threatened to resign if I stayed at the school. He said I brought memories of death." His voice was neutral, but Aurora perceived the pain beneath the surface. Don Miguel couldn't risk losing another teacher. The town needed the school. Aurora felt a pang of indignation. Imagining Mateo, recently orphaned, expelled by absurd superstitions, provoked a rage she hadn't experienced for a long time. "It's unfair," she murmured. Mateo looked at her, and in his eyes was an understanding that went beyond his years. "Life is rarely fair," he responded, with a serenity that moved her. "But sometimes it offers us second chances." In that moment, under the golden light of sunset, with the valley stretching at their feet and the cabin already visible in the distance, Aurora understood what her heart had known for weeks, that Mateo had come into her life not only as someone to save, but as someone who, without intending to, was saving her. Spring advanced with determined steps along the slopes of the Sierra. The meadows, previously hidden under snow, were now covered with wildflowers that transformed the landscape into a multicolored canvas. Aurora and Mateo established a routine that flowed with the naturalness of a river. Mornings dedicated to the property's tasks, afternoons to shared projects, nights to conversations by the fire or to the music of the old guitar that now rarely returned to the closet. But the outside world, the one they had kept at bay during winter, began to filter into their refuge like drops of water in a dam. One afternoon, while Aurora collected medicinal herbs on the eastern slope, she spotted in the distance the figure of a rider ascending the path toward the cabin. The unexpected visit immediately put her on alert. She left her basket half-filled and hurried back. She found Mateo on the porch, conversing with an older man whom Aurora recognized as Santiago Torres, one of the town's merchants. The man removed his hat upon seeing her arrive. "Mrs. Mendez," he greeted with a nod. "Forgive the intrusion. I was passing nearby and thought to come up and say hello." Aurora knew it was an excuse. Nobody passed nearby her cabin, located as it was at the top of a path that led nowhere else. The man had come expressly, probably driven by the curiosity that their visit to town had awakened. "How can I help you, Mr. Torres?" she asked directly. The man seemed momentarily disconcerted by her frankness. "Well, you see," he began, twisting his hat between his hands. "In town we're organizing the San Isidro Festival as every year, and we thought that perhaps you and young Ibarra might want to attend." Aurora looked at him with poorly disguised surprise. Since Sebastian's death, no one had invited her to the town's celebrations. Not that she would have wanted to attend, but the tacit exclusion had been evident. "That's very kind," she responded cautiously, "but we have a lot of work up here." "Oh, but I insist," Torres continued with an enthusiasm that Aurora found forced. "Don Miguel Soto specifically asked about the boy, and Father Vega thinks it would be appropriate for you to participate in the life of the community." The mention of the priest clarified things for Aurora. It wasn't an invitation born of goodwill, but a form of surveillance. The town wanted to observe them, evaluate their relationship, confirm, or disprove the speculations that undoubtedly circulated since their visit. "We'll think about it," Mateo intervened, with a cordial smile that contrasted with Aurora's tense expression. "Thank you for the invitation, Don Santiago." The merchant left shortly after, not without casting curious glances around, as if mentally cataloguing every detail of the cabin to relate later. "We won't go," Aurora declared as soon as the man disappeared down the path. Mateo, who had maintained a neutral expression throughout the visit, looked at her with eyes that revealed more than his words conveyed. "Why not?" he asked softly. "It could be interesting." "Interesting," she repeated with a dry laugh. "It will be a barely disguised interrogation. They want to make sure we're not living in sin or some similar nonsense." A tense silence settled between them. It was the first time either of them had mentioned, even indirectly, the nature of their relationship. For months they had navigated ambiguous waters, more than employer and employee, less than what exactly? Aurora didn't want to put a name to that nascent intimacy that had arisen between them. "Maybe it's better to face it," Mateo finally suggested. "Let them see us. Let them verify that there's nothing improper." Aurora looked at him fixedly. Was it her imagination, or was there a hint of sadness in the way he pronounced that last word? "We have nothing to prove," she responded with more harshness than she intended. "What happens under this roof is nobody's business but ours." Mateo nodded, but Aurora noticed that his gaze darkened. She wanted to say something more, explain that she wasn't ashamed of him, that that wasn't what made her reject the invitation, but the words got stuck in her throat, and the moment passed. That night, the guitar music sounded different. The melodies that Mateo drew from the strings had a melancholic undertone that resonated in the corners of the cabin like the echo of an unasked question. The following days passed with apparent normality, but Aurora perceived a subtle change in the air, like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Mateo continued fulfilling his tasks, continued smiling, continued playing the guitar at night, but there was a new distance between them, an invisible space that neither knew how to cross. A week after the merchant's visit, Aurora was returning from checking the traps she had set in the forest when she saw Don Miguel Soto dismounting in front of the cabin. Mateo came out to receive him with a joy that she found painful in its sincerity. It had been days since she had seen him smile like that. She approached with her heart racing, wondering what new intrusion this visit would bring. "Aurora," Don Miguel greeted with a cordiality that seemed genuine. "Forgive the unannounced visit. I had to come to this part of the Sierra and thought to bring something for Mateo." The professor took from his saddlebag a package wrapped in cloth, which he handed to the young man with evident emotion. "We were cleaning the school storeroom," he explained, "and I found this among your father's belongings. I thought you'd like to have it." Mateo unwrapped the package with trembling hands. It was a book, old and worn, with corners bent from use. "Don Quixote de la Mancha," Aurora read on the worn spine. It was his favorite, Mateo murmured, caressing the cover with reverence. "He would read me a chapter every night when I was a child." Aurora observed how his eyes moistened, how he hugged the book against his chest as if it were the most valuable of treasures. And she understood, with a clarity that overwhelmed her, how little she really knew of his pain, of his loss. Don Miguel invited them for coffee. Unlike the previous visit, this time Aurora accepted. While she prepared the beverage, she listened from the kitchen to the animated conversation between the professor and Mateo. They talked about the school, about former students, about projects that Mateo's father had initiated and that now languished. "Under the new teacher's direction, the library your father wanted so much to establish was never completed," Don Miguel was commenting. "The new director considers that children don't need more books than the Bible and basic texts." "Dad would have hated that," Mateo responded, with a mixture of sadness and indignation. "He always said that books were windows to the world, especially for those of us who live in remote valleys." When Aurora returned with the coffee, She noticed that Don Miguel observed her with an evaluative but not hostile expression. "Mateo was telling me about the work you've done on the property," he commented. "It seems you've formed a good team." Aurora nodded, not knowing quite how to respond. The professor continued in a more cautious tone. "I must confess to you, Aurora, that when I learned Mateo was here, I worried. Not about you," he quickly clarified, "but about what the town might say. You know how gossip is." "I know perfectly well," she responded dryly. Don Miguel nodded, like someone who understands more than what is said. "However," he continued, "now that I see you, I understand better. Both of you have suffered losses that few would understand. Perhaps that's why you found in each other what the rest of the valley couldn't offer you." The observation, so simple and so accurate, left Aurora speechless. She had never thought of her relationship with Mateo in those terms, but it was true. They shared the same type of pain, the same sense of uprooting, the same resistance to the easy consolation that others offered. Don Miguel's visit extended until sunset. When he finally said goodbye, he did so with an invitation that Aurora didn't expect. "The school needs help reorganizing the library," he told them. "I know it's a project that would have mattered to Mateo's father. And you, Aurora, if I remember correctly, were always fond of reading, weren't you?" It was true. Before Sebastian's death, books had been her refuge, her way of escaping the harshness of life in the Sierra. Afterward, even that had lost its flavor. "Perhaps," she responded cautiously, "perhaps we could help." When Don Miguel had left, Mateo turned to her with an expression that mixed surprise and joy. "Do you mean it? Will we help with the library?" Aurora nodded, not fully understanding her own decision. Perhaps it was the way Mateo's eyes shone when talking about his father's books. Perhaps it was the genuine respect that Don Miguel had shown them, so different from the unhealthy curiosity of the town. Or perhaps, simply, it was that she was tired of letting fear direct her life. "Your father was right," she finally said. "Books are important, and the town needs that library." That night, as they dined by the fire, the invisible barrier that had arisen between them in recent days seemed to dissolve. Mateo read her passages from Don Quixote, and Aurora rediscovered the pleasure of getting lost in stories that transported her far from her reality. At some point their gazes met above the pages, and Aurora felt something loosening in her chest, like a knot that was beginning, very slowly, to untie. "Thank you," said Mateo, carefully closing the book. "For this, for everything." Aurora didn't respond with words. She simply extended her hand across the table and placed it on his, in a gesture so simple and so laden with meaning that both held their breath. And so as night fell over the mountains, as the town's whispers continued weaving stories about them in the distance, Aurora and Mateo found, in shared silence, a language of their own that needed no translation. The old-school library was little more than a dusty room, with empty shelves and boxes stacked in disarray. Aurora and Mateo contemplated the space with a mixture of dismay and determination. Don Miguel, who had guided them there, seemed almost embarrassed. "After the epidemic, no one had the spirit to continue the project," he explained. And then, with the arrival of the new director, he left the sentence unfinished. But all three knew what it implied. The new director, Don Ernesto Cifuentes, was a man of strict ideas who considered recreational reading an unnecessary distraction. Fortunately, he was traveling in the provincial capital and wouldn't return until the following week. "That's why I wanted to take advantage of his absence," Don Miguel confessed, "to advance enough to present him with a fait accompli when he returns." Aurora toured the room, opening one of the boxes. It was full of books in various states of preservation, some almost new, others with yellowed pages and worn covers. Titles of adventures, science, history, poetry, an entire collection gathered with love and now abandoned to oblivion. "It was my father's project," Mateo murmured, running his fingers along the spine of an atlas. "He spent years collecting these books, convincing families to donate those they no longer read, writing to publishers." Aurora noticed the gleam in his eyes, the contained emotion in his voice. She understood then that this project was much more than organizing books. It was a way to honor his father's memory, to give continuity to his legacy. "Let's begin," she said simply, rolling up her sleeves. During the following days, Aurora and Mateo went down to town every morning to work in the library. Don Miguel had given them total freedom to organize it as they thought best. At first, the other teachers observed them with curiosity, but soon Mateo's enthusiasm proved contagious. Miss Lucia, who taught the youngest children, began to help them in her free hours. Mr. Ramirez, the science teacher, Conti, reputed his knowledge to classify books in his area. Aurora rediscovered in this work something she thought lost: the pleasure of being part of a shared project, of seeing how her efforts joined with those of others to create something greater than the sum of its parts. It was during the afternoon of the fourth day when children began to timidly peek at the library door. At first they just looked curious and silent. Then a girl of about 8 dared to enter. "Can I help?" she asked in a barely audible voice. Mateo looked at her with a smile that illuminated his entire face. "What's your name?" "Isabel," responded the little girl, twisting the edge of her apron. "Of course you can help, Isabel," Mateo affirmed, crouching to her height. "In fact, we need an expert in fairy tales to tell us which are the best." The girl's eyes opened in amazement at the assigned responsibility. Aurora observed how Mateo showed her the illustrated books, how he listened attentively to the little one's opinions, how he answered her questions with infinite patience, and something stirred inside her, a tenderness she hadn't experienced for years. The next day, Isabel returned with 3 friends. The day after, there were 8 children filling the library with laughter and questions. Mateo organized a reading corner with cushions on the floor and began to dedicate an hour each afternoon to reading them stories. Aurora, from her post, cataloging books, observed the scene with a mixture of admiration and nostalgia. "You're good with them," she commented one afternoon, as they returned to the cabin. Mateo shrugged, but Aurora noticed the blush that colored his cheeks. "I like children," he responded simply. "Their way of seeing the world, their curiosity, they remind me of when my father would read to me at night." Aurora nodded, understanding. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to remember how before the tragedy she and Sebastian had talked about having children, how they had prepared a small room in the cabin with a cradle that he himself had carved, how afterward she had closed that door and had not reopened it in 3 years. One afternoon, while the children listened enthralled as Mateo read a story about pirates, the library door opened abruptly. Aurora startled to see Don Ernesto Cifuentes, the director, enter, followed by Father Vega. Both stopped short upon contemplating the scene. "What does this mean?" asked Cifuentes, frowning. "I didn't authorize any reading session." The children immediately tensed, intimidated by the presence of the severe director. Mateo closed the book calmly and stood up. "Don Miguel invited us to help with the library," he explained with a serenity that Aurora admired. "The children became interested, and we thought it would be good to foster their love for reading." Father Vega stepped forward, his gaze alternating between Aurora and Mateo with evident disapproval. "It seems inappropriate to me," he declared, "that you two are in charge of educating our children." Aurora felt her blood boil. It was one thing for them to talk about her, but quite another to question Mateo's integrity. "Teacher Ibarra's son is perfectly capable of reading stories to the children," she intervened, with a voice firmer than she expected. "Unless now morality also prevents enjoying pirate stories." A tense silence followed her words. The children observed the exchange with frightened eyes. It was then that Don Miguel appeared at the door, alerted by some student about the situation. "Ah, Don Ernesto, Father Vega," he greeted, with a calm that contrasted with the tension in the environment. "I see you've already discovered our little project. Isn't it wonderful? The library that Teacher Ibarra always dreamed of, finally taking shape." Cifuentes seemed momentarily disconcerted by Don Miguel's enthusiasm. "I don't recall approving this," he insisted, though with less conviction. "It was a faculty initiative," responded Don Miguel, skillfully guiding the 2 men toward the door. "Come, let me show you how we've catalogued everything. The parents are delighted, by the way. Mrs. Gutierrez was telling me yesterday that her little Carolina is finally interested in reading." As they moved away, Aurora exchanged a glance with Mateo. Both knew that this small battle was won, but the war had just begun. That night, sitting on the cabin porch, contemplating the stars that speckled the Sierra sky, Mateo broke the reflective silence that enveloped them. "What you said today in the library, thank you." Aurora glanced at him sideways. His profile was silhouetted against the night sky, more defined than she remembered when he arrived at her door months ago. He was no longer the emaciated and frightened boy. He had become a young man with purpose, with strength. "I only said the truth," she responded with simplicity. Mateo smiled, and Aurora felt that smile warming her more than the coffee she held between her hands. "Do you know what I miss most about my father?" he asked, his gaze lost on the horizon. "It's not the big things, it's how he listened to me, as if every idea of mine, however small, deserved his full attention." Aurora nodded, understanding perfectly. What she missed most about Sebastian weren't the grand gestures either, but the way he whistled while chopping wood, or how he always left the last cookie for her. "The children adore you," she commented, slightly changing the subject. "You have your father's gift for connecting with them." Mateo looked at her with an intensity that surprised her. "Do you think I could be a teacher? Like him?" The question floated between them, laden with implications. If Mateo became a teacher, he would no longer live in the cabin. He would no longer be her assistant. His life would take its own course, away from her. Aurora felt a pang of, what? Sadness, fear. She didn't want to examine that emotion too closely. "You would be an excellent teacher," she responded honestly. "You have patience, wisdom, and you love knowledge. Any child would be lucky to have you as a teacher." Mateo's smile widened, illuminating his face with a joy that Aurora found contagious. "Thank you," he said simply. "It means a lot coming from you." They remained silent, drinking coffee, each lost in their thoughts. The night of the Sierra enveloped them with its ancestral peace, so different from the bustle and tensions of the town. Aurora realized that despite the problems with the director and the priest, the last few days had been the most fulfilling she could remember in a long time. "What do you think Cifuentes will say when he discovers we've catalogued the entire astronomy section as science and not as pagan speculations?" Mateo suddenly asked. With a mischievous gleam in his eyes, Aurora couldn't contain a laugh. "Probably the same as when he sees we've put Frankenstein next to the science books," she responded, remembering their small rebellion that afternoon. They laughed together, and Aurora marveled at how natural it felt. Laughter, another thing she thought lost forever, and that nevertheless Mateo had brought back into her life, like someone who rescues a treasure buried under years of pain. In that moment, under the starry mantle of the Sierra night, Aurora felt something crystallizing. Within her, a certainty that had been silently forming for months. She could no longer imagine the cabin without Mateo, without his music, without his stories, without his way of looking at the world with ever-new eyes. The idea frightened and comforted her in equal parts. Because if there was one thing she had learned in her 25 years of life, it was that everything you love can vanish in an instant. And to love again meant risking losing again. Was she willing to take that risk? The answer floated in the night air, like a question she still didn't dare to answer. The small rusty key weighed in Aurora's hand as if it were made of lead. It had been so long since she had used it that she had almost forgotten its existence. Hidden at the bottom of a drawer, under handkerchiefs and memories she preferred not to disturb. It had been a morning like any other. Mateo had gone down to town early to continue the work in the library, while she stayed to attend to matters in the cabin. Spring was in full bloom, and Aurora had decided it was time for a thorough cleaning, to open windows and allow fresh air to renew the forgotten corners of her home. That's how she came to the closed room, the small chamber at the end of the hallway that she hadn't entered in 3 years. The room that Sebastian had prepared with such excitement for the child who was never born. Aurora stood before the closed door, the key trembling slightly between her fingers. Memories came in waves. Sebastian carving the cradle, she embroidering small sheets, both discussing names by the fire. And then, the accident. The double loss that had left her without a husband and without the hope of the child she carried in her womb. With a decisive movement, she inserted the key in the lock. The mechanism, hardened by years of disuse, yielded with a squeal of protest. When the door opened, the smell of confinement hit her like a physical presence. The room remained exactly as she had left it, the wooden cradle in the center, covered with a sheet to protect it from dust, the rocking chair in the corner, where she had imagined so many times that she would cradle her baby, the small wardrobe where she had stored the few garments she managed to prepare. She entered the chamber with faltering steps, like one who enters a forgotten temple. Her fingers brushed the cradle, raising a cloud of dust that danced in the ray of sunlight filtering through the covered window. Carefully, she removed the protective sheet. The cradle was still beautiful. Sebastian had carved small forest animals in the wood, foxes, rabbits, birds, all intertwined in a fluid design that ran around the contour. It had been his anniversary gift, finished just weeks before his death. Aurora sat in the rocking chair, allowing tears, contained for so long, to flow freely. They weren't bitter tears like those she had shed in the first days of her loss. They were calmer, more reflective, like a river that has finally found its course after the storm. It was there, rocked by memories, where she made a decision. It was time to let light into this room, not to erase the past, but to honor it in a different way. When Matteo returned that afternoon, he found Aurora busily cleaning the small room. The windows were wide open, the old sheets hung out in the sun, the furniture freed from its layer of dust. "What is this place?" he asked, stopping at the threshold, sensing he was witnessing something important. Aurora put down the cloth she was holding and turned to him. She had been so absorbed in her task that she hadn't heard him arrive. It was going to be our child's room," she responded with simplicity. Matteo remained motionless, understanding the weight of what Aurora had just shared. "I didn't know," he began, but stopped, not knowing how to continue. "Nobody knows," she explained, passing a hand over the now clean surface of the cradle. "I lost the baby the same day as Sebastian. It was too much to talk about." Matteo nodded, his face reflecting a deep respect for her pain. "Can I help?" he finally offered. Aurora looked at him, grateful for the simplicity of his offer. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding and a genuine desire to accompany her. "The windows need cleaning," she responded, pointing to the opaque glass from years of abandonment. "And maybe move the cradle to where it gets more light." They worked together in silence, gradually transforming the ghost room into a living space again. Aurora was surprised at how liberating the process was, as if each speck of dust they eliminated was also a layer of pain that detached from her heart. By nightfall, the room shone with a new light. The cradle, now situated under the window, caught the last rays of the setting sun, which made the polished wood and carved animals gleam. "It's beautiful," commented Matteo, running his fingers over the figures. "Your husband was a talented craftsman." "He was," confirmed Aurora, and for the first time the memory of Sebastian came accompanied more by pride than by pain. He loved working with wood. He said each piece had its own spirit, and his job was simply to free it. They sat on the floor, exhausted but satisfied with the work done. Aurora felt a strange peace, as if she had untied a knot that had been too tight in her chest for too long. "You know," said Matteo after a long silence, "my mother used to say that memories are like seeds. You can bury them and pretend they don't exist, but they'll still be there, growing in the dark. Or you can plant them under the sun, water them with tears if necessary, and let them become something new." Aurora looked at him, surprised by the wisdom in his words. "Your mother was an intelligent woman," she responded softly. "She was," he nodded with a sad smile. "I think you would have gotten along well, and she with you." In that moment, sitting on the floor of the room that had contained so much pain and now began to harbor hope, Aurora felt something fundamental changing between them. They were no longer simply two people united by circumstance or convenience. They were two souls who had shared their deepest wounds, and, in doing so, had found a path toward healing. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping me today." Matteo smiled, and in his eyes Aurora saw reflected the same certainty that was blooming in her own heart. "Thank you," he responded, "for letting me in." The next morning, Aurora awoke with a clarity she hadn't experienced in a long time. While preparing breakfast, she made another decision she had been postponing. It was time to take down Sebastian's portraits that dominated the living room. Not to forget him, but to keep him in a more intimate place, less omnipresent. When Matteo entered the kitchen, he found her standing on a chair, carefully taking down the large portrait of her wedding. "What are you doing?" he asked, approaching. "To hold the chair. Reorganizing," she responded simply. "I think this will be better in my bedroom." Matteo nodded, understanding the meaning of the gesture. Together they relocated the portraits, leaving only a small one on the mantelpiece. The space felt different now, more open, brighter. They breakfasted with renewed appetite, making plans for the day. The library still needed work, and Don Miguel had asked for their help in organizing a small book fair to involve more families from the town. "I've been thinking," Matteo said suddenly with some hesitation. "Don Miguel mentioned there might be a position for an assistant teacher for the next course. He asked if I would be interested." Aurora felt a jolt in her stomach. The possibility that Matteo would establish himself permanently in town, that he would have his own life independent of her, filled her with contradictory emotions. "It would be perfect for you," she responded with sincerity, although a part of her rebelled against her own words. "The children adore you." Matteo looked at her intensely, as if seeking something more in her response. "It would mean going down to town every day," he continued. Perhaps it would be more practical to move there." The idea fell between them like a stone in a calm pond. Aurora felt she couldn't breathe. The cabin without Matteo, returning to the solitude of before, it was a thought that caused her physical pain. "I understand," she managed to say, striving to maintain a neutral tone. "It makes sense, of course." Matteo continued observing her as if waiting for something more. When she added nothing, he stood and began to clear the breakfast dishes. "It's just a possibility," he finally said. "I haven't decided anything yet." The day passed with a subtle tension floating between them. They worked in the library as always, helped the children with their readings, conversed with Don Miguel about the fair, but there was something unsaid that vibrated in every exchange. When they returned to the cabin at nightfall, Aurora felt that each step brought her closer to an inevitable crossroads. A part of her wanted to ask Matteo to stay, not to consider moving to town. But another part, the one that had painfully learned that holding on too tightly to someone only makes their loss more devastating, advised her to keep silent. It was Matteo who finally broke the impasse as they dined by the fire. "I don't want to leave," he said suddenly, with a frankness that startled her. "If I accept the position, I want to continue living here, with you." Aurora looked at him, feeling her heart accelerate. "The path is long," she responded, clinging to practicality. "And in winter, it will be impossible to travel it daily. We'll find solutions," he insisted. "I could stay in town for a few days when the weather is bad, but my home—" He hesitated for an instant. "My home is here now, if you want it that way too." The last phrase hung between them, laden with meanings that went far beyond living arrangements. Aurora felt they were on the edge of something new, something that frightened and attracted her in equal parts. "I also want you to stay," she finally responded, the words emerging from a place she could no longer deny. "This cabin would feel empty without you." Matteo's smile illuminated his face in a way that made Aurora feel a warmth expanding from her chest to the tips of her fingers. "Then it's decided," he said, with a new certainty in his voice. "I'll stay." That night, as Aurora prepared for bed, her gaze fell on Sebastian's portrait that now rested on her bedside table. For the first time, she felt no guilt looking at it. Instead, she perceived a strange peace, as if she had reached a silent reconciliation with her past. "I'm learning to live again," she whispered to the portrait. "I hope you understand." And as she turned off the lamp, it seemed to her that Sebastian's smile in the photograph was a little warmer, a little more understanding, as if somehow he was giving her his blessing. The town square buzzed with activity under the early summer sun. Tables covered with colorful tablecloths displayed books of all sizes and conditions, from ancient volumes bound in leather to thin booklets with worn covers. Children and adults wandered among the stalls with expressions ranging from curiosity to reverence. The book fair, an idea born in conversations between Don Miguel and Mateo, had come to life with a force that surprised everyone. What began as a modest exchange of books between families had become an event that attracted even people from nearby towns. Aurora observed everything from her stall, where she had carefully arranged duplicate copies from the school library. It felt strange to see herself participating in a community celebration after years of voluntary seclusion. Stranger still was realizing that she was enjoying it. Aurora called Lucia, the young teacher, approaching with enthusiasm. "Have you seen how many people have come? Even Don Francisco, the pharmacist, has brought medical books to donate to the library." Aurora smiled at Lucia's enthusiasm, who in recent weeks had become something close to a friend. It was refreshing the way the young teacher treated her, without the wariness she still perceived in many town inhabitants, without the unhealthy curiosity about her relationship with Mateo. "Everything has turned out better than we expected," she responded, pointing around. "Mateo will be delighted." Mateo indeed was the soul of the celebration. Aurora saw him move between stalls, animatedly converse with parents and children, organize the little ones for scheduled readings under the great elm in the square. There was in him a vitality, a purpose, that transformed him. He was no longer the frightened boy who had arrived at her door amid the storm. He had become a young man who found his place in the world. Observing him like this, in his element, provoked contradictory feelings in Aurora. On one hand, an almost maternal pride at seeing him flourish. On the other, a pang of unease at the evidence that Mateo no longer needed her as before. He was forging his own path, one that could eventually lead him away from her. "Mrs. Mendez," a childish voice interrupted her thoughts. "Will you help me choose a book?" It was Isabel, the little girl who had become a regular visitor to the library. Aurora crouched to her height and smiled at her. "Of course, Isabel. What kind of story would you like to read?" The girl reflected with comic seriousness, furrowing her brow and biting her lip. "I want one with a princess who is brave," she finally decided. "Not one of those who just wait for the prince." Aurora laughed, delighted with the response. She began to search among the volumes, explaining to Isabel the different options. She didn't realize someone had stopped at her stall until a shadow fell over the books. "An impressive selection," commented a male voice that Aurora didn't immediately recognize. She looked up to find a middle-aged man, well-dressed, with an air of natural authority. He seemed vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place him. "Thank you," she responded cautiously, while Isabel, suddenly shy, partially hid behind her. "Forgive my lack of manners," said the man, extending his hand. "Eduardo Montero, educational inspector of the province. I've come to evaluate the school and have found myself with this wonderful fair." Aurora shook his hand, now understanding why he seemed familiar. She had briefly seen him years ago during an official visit to the town. "Aurora Mendez," she introduced herself. The inspector seemed to recognize her name. "Sebastian Mendez's widow?" he asked, and Aurora tensed, preparing for the usual comments. However, what followed surprised her. "Your husband was a respected man. I had the honor of meeting him during my last visit, when he helped organize the reconstruction of the river bridge." Aurora nodded, moved by the respectful memory. "That's how he was," she responded simply. "Always willing to help." The conversation drifted toward the fair and the school library. The inspector was impressed by the work done, especially when Aurora explained that it had been Mateo's initiative, continuing his father's legacy. "I'd like to meet that young man," commented Montero. "The educational system needs people with such passion." As if summoned, Mateo appeared at that moment, surrounded by children who followed him as if he were the Pied Piper of Hamelin. "Aurora," he called, not noticing the inspector. "Don Miguel wants to start the main reading. Could you help us organize the little ones?" The inspector observed Mateo with evident interest. "Is it him?" he asked Aurora in a low voice. She nodded, feeling a pride she didn't try to disguise. "Mateo Ibarra," she confirmed, "the son of teacher Ibarra." When introduced to the inspector, Mateo showed the same respectful but confident courtesy he had developed in recent months. They conversed briefly, and Aurora noticed how the young man's face lit up when Montero mentioned the possibility of official support for the library. The rest of the afternoon passed in a whirlwind of activities. The reading under the elm, where Don Miguel read passages from Don Quixote, while the children listened enthralled. The small improvised concert, where Mateo played the guitar accompanying some students who recited poems. The exchange of books, where each family offered volumes they no longer read in exchange for new ones. Aurora found herself enjoying each moment, integrating into the community in a way she would have considered impossible a few months ago. She even exchanged some recipes with Doña Carmen, the same one who had previously looked at her with suspicion, and accepted an invitation to have tea with Isabel's mother. It was at sunset, when the fair began to disperse, when she noticed Mateo's absence. She searched for him among the groups that still remained in the square but didn't find him. "He's in the church," Don Miguel informed her, noticing her search. Father Vega wanted to speak with him. Aurora felt a pang of unease. The priest had never hidden his disapproval of their situation. What would he want from Mateo now? She headed toward the small church that dominated one end of the square. The door was ajar, and voices reached her from within. She stopped, hesitating whether to enter or wait outside. "Your father would be proud, boy," she heard Father Vega say in a surprisingly kind tone. "The fair has been a success, and your participation in the library is admirable." "Thank you, Father," responded Mateo's voice, with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. There was a silence, and then the priest's voice continued, now more cautious. "However, there are matters that concern me. Your current situation, living in Mrs. Mendez's cabin. You know it generates comments in town." Aurora held her breath, waiting for Mateo's response. "I know, Father," he finally said, "but I assure you there's nothing improper in our relationship. Mrs. Mendez has given me work and a home when I needed it most. I owe her a lot." "I believe you, son," responded the priest, to Aurora's surprise. "I know your character and your father's, but appearances matter, especially now that you're considering a position at the school." "What do you suggest, then?" asked Mateo, and Aurora detected tension in his voice. "Inspector Montero is impressed with you," explained Father Vega. "He mentioned the possibility of giving you a scholarship to complete your studies at the Teachers' College in the capital. It would be a unique opportunity." Aurora felt the ground moving beneath her feet. The capital? That would mean Mateo would leave, perhaps for years. The idea gave her a void in her stomach. "It's very generous," responded Mateo, and Aurora couldn't discern if there was enthusiasm or reservation in his tone. "I'll have to think about it." "Of course," conceded the priest, "but don't wait too long. These opportunities don't present themselves twice." Aurora quickly moved away from the door when she heard steps approaching. She hid behind a column in the atrium, not wanting to be discovered listening. She saw Mateo exit, his face thoughtful, as he descended the church steps and disappeared among the last groups remaining in the square. She remained motionless for a few minutes, processing what she had just heard. Part of her was happy for Mateo. It was an opportunity he deserved, a recognition of his abilities. Another part, more selfish, rebelled at the idea of losing him. When she finally emerged from her hiding place, the sky had turned purple and orange. She found Mateo helping dismantle one of the last stalls. He worked in silence with mechanical movements that betrayed his distraction. "There you are," she said, approaching. "I was looking for you." Mateo looked up, and Aurora saw in his eyes a mixture of emotions she couldn't interpret. "I'm sorry," he apologized. "I got caught up talking with Father Vega." Aurora nodded, debating between confessing she had heard part of the conversation or waiting for him to tell her. She opted for the latter. "Everything all right?" she asked, with feigned casualness. Mateo hesitated for an instant, as if evaluating his response. "Yes," he finally said. "Just school matters." The path back to the cabin was unusually silent. Aurora felt the tension growing between them, an invisible wall made of unspoken words. She wanted to ask him about the scholarship, about his plans, but feared the answer. It was only when they reached the cabin while unsaddling the horses under the starry sky when Mateo finally spoke. "Inspector Montero spoke with Father Vega," he said suddenly, as if the words had been pressing to come out. He mentioned the possibility of a scholarship to study at the Teachers' College. Aurora nodded, trying to make her voice sound neutral. It's a great opportunity. In the capital, he added, looking at her directly. It would mean leaving for 2 years, maybe more. The silence, the tea followed, weighed like lead. Aurora continued brushing her horse with mechanical movements, struggling to find the right words. She wanted to be generous, encourage him to follow his dream. But the idea of returning to solitude, of losing the presence that had illuminated her life in recent months, was unbearable to her. You should accept, she finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It's what your father would have wanted. Matteo put down the brush and approached her. Gently he took her hand, stopping the nervous movement with which she continued grooming the horse. "And what is it that you want, Aurora?" he asked, with an intensity that disarmed her. The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meanings. Aurora felt the warmth of Matteo's hand on hers, the accelerated beating of her own heart, the weight of a decision that could change the course of both lives. "I want," she began, but the words refused to come out. What did she really want? To ask him to stay, tying him to a life in the mountains when he could have a bright future, to let him go even knowing that his departure would leave an impossible void to fill. "I want you to be happy," she finally said, opting for the simplest truth, the one that encompassed all others. Matteo looked at her for a long time as if seeking something more in her words, in her eyes. Then, with a softness that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze, he brought Aurora's hand to his lips and deposited on it a kiss as light as the brush of a feather. "That's what I want for you too," he murmured against her skin. And in that simple gesture, in that barely perceptible contact, Aurora felt something irrevocably changing between them. They were no longer the lonely widow and the helpless orphan. They were two people on the threshold of something new, something that frightened and attracted them in equal parts. That night, as the cabin slept under the starry mantle of the Sierra, two hearts remained awake, beating to the rhythm of unanswered questions and possibilities that were just beginning to be glimpsed on the horizon. The days following the book fair passed in a strange limbo. Aurora and Matteo continued with their daily routines, work in the cabin, visits to the library, lessons with the children, but there was something different in the air. An unspoken expectation, a silent question that floated between them like a ghost. The scholarship for the Teachers' College had become a tangible reality. Inspector Montero, before leaving, had left the necessary documents with Don Miguel. Only Matteo's signature was needed to set the process in motion. "You have 2 weeks to decide," the inspector had told him. "The course begins in September. 2 weeks. 14 days that passed with agonizing slowness and, at the same time, with dizzying speed. Aurora observed how Matteo became increasingly immersed in his thoughts, how he alternated between moments of enthusiasm at imagining the capital, his studies, his future as a teacher, and periods of reflective silence when his gaze was lost in the mountains that surrounded them. One afternoon, while Aurora harvested herbs in the small garden they had planted together in spring, she found him sitting on the porch with the scholarship papers spread out on the table. His face reflected the internal battle he was waging. "Do you need help with that?" she asked, leaving her basket on the ground. Matteo looked up, as if coming out of a trance. "I'm just trying to understand all the details," he responded, forcing a smile. "There are many clauses in small print." Aurora sat across from him, observing the documents. Indeed, they were complex forms full of legal terms and long-term commitments. "It says here that after completing your studies, you must serve as a teacher for at least 5 years in the province," she pointed out, reading one of the paragraphs. "It's a significant commitment." Matteo nodded, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture that Aurora had learned to recognize as a sign of his anxiety. 5 years, he murmured. "By then I'll be almost 25. The figure floated between them. 25 years. The age Aurora was now. The age at which she had already known love, marriage, loss, rebirth. An entire life condensed in those years that for Matteo were still to come. "It's enough time to build something solid," she commented, trying to sound encouraging. By then you'll be a respected teacher with experience. And afterward? He asked, looking her directly in the eyes. The question contained much more than it seemed at first glance. It wasn't just about his professional career, but about his life, his dreams, his affections, them. Aurora held his gaze, feeling they were on the edge of a conversation for which she didn't feel prepared. Afterward you'll be free to choose, she finally responded, with a caution that didn't go unnoticed by Matteo. He nodded slowly, like someone confirming a suspicion. Then, with a decisive movement, he gathered the papers and put them in the envelope. "Let's go for a walk," he proposed suddenly. "I need fresh air to think." The path that ascended from the cabin toward the mountain ridge was steep but beautiful. As they climbed, the valley unfolded beneath them like a tapestry of greens and ochres, with the tiny town at its center, the river winding like a silver ribbon. They walked in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts. Aurora observed Matteo from the corner of her eye, the determination in his step, the tense line of his jaw. He was no longer the emaciated boy who had arrived at her door in the midst of the storm. He had transformed into a young man, strong, with purpose, a man who would soon make a decision that could separate their paths. They reached the summit as the sun began to descend toward the horizon, tinting the sky orange and purple. From there, the view was even more impressive. Mountains that extended as far as the eye could see, valleys that seemed to cradle life between their folds. "My father used to bring me here when I was a child," commented Matteo, sitting on a flat rock. "He said that from the heights, one understands small things better." Aurora sat beside him, letting silence extend between them, comfortable as a familiar blanket. "Do you know what's hardest about all this?" he continued after a while. "It's not deciding about the scholarship. It's deciding about us." The word us hung in the air like a musical note. Aurora felt her heart accelerate. It was the first time either of them openly acknowledged that there was an us, something deeper than the relationship between a lonely widow and the young man she had taken in. "Matteo," she began, not knowing exactly what to say. "No," he interrupted, her gently. "Let me speak, please. I've rehearsed this for days, and if I don't say it now, I might never find the courage." Aurora nodded, feeling a knot in her throat. Matteo breathed deeply, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to disappear. "When I arrived at your door that night, I was convinced my life was over," he said in a quiet voice. "I had lost my family, my home, my purpose. I was a body moving by inertia, nothing more." He paused, absently plucking a blade of grass growing between the rocks. "And then you opened the door with your rifle and your distrust," he smiled slightly. "For you saved my life that night, Aurora. Not just from the cold, but from myself." Aurora wanted to say something, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. Matteo continued, his voice gaining firmness. "During these months, I've seen how life returned to you. How you began to laugh again, to enjoy music, to open up to the world. I've seen you transform just as you've seen me. We've healed together, Aurora." He turned to look at her directly, and in his eyes was a determination that overwhelmed her. "The scholarship is a wonderful opportunity," he continued. "I'd be a fool not to recognize it, but every time I think about leaving you, about spending years away from this cabin, from the mountains, from you, I feel something breaking inside me." Aurora felt tears accumulating in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. There was something important in this moment, something that required all her strength. "I don't want to be an obstacle to your future," she finally managed to say. "You deserve that opportunity, Matteo. You deserve to build your life without ties to the past or to commitments born of gratitude." Matteo shook his head, taking her hands in his. The contact was warm, comforting, like coming home after a long journey. "It's not about gratitude," he affirmed vehemently. "What I feel for you goes far beyond that. It's—" He hesitated, seeking the right words. "It's as if my entire life had been a path toward you, as if all the losses, all the pains were necessary steps to find you." Aurora felt something breaking inside her, a last barrier she had kept up even when all others had fallen. The tears, contained for so long, began to flow freely down her cheeks. "I'm afraid," she confessed in a whisper. "Afraid of loving you and losing you as I lost Sebastian. Afraid that you'll leave and not return. Afraid that you'll stay for me and one day reproach me for the life you didn't live." Matteo released her hands only to cradle her face with infinite tenderness. With his thumbs, he dried her tears in Sue, an intimate gesture that Aurora felt her heart painfully expanding in her chest. "I'm afraid too," he admitted. "But I've learned that fear shouldn't prevent us from living. My father used to say that real life begins precisely where our safety zone ends." They remained in silence, face to face, as the last ray of sun disappeared behind the mountains and the sky took on a deep blue where the first stars began to appear. "What do we do then?" Aurora finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Matteo smiled, a smile full of hope and possibilities. "We choose together," he responded. "Not you for me, nor I for you. Together, Aurora, as we've done everything else." And there, under the starry mantle of the Sierra, with the sleeping valley at their feet and the wind whispering among the pines, Aurora felt that a chapter of her life was closing, and another completely new one was beginning to be written. The news spread through the town with the speed of a summer wildfire. Aurora Mendez and Matteo Ibarra would marry at the end of August. No one knew exactly how the rumor had started. Perhaps someone had seen them together in the store, buying white fabric. Perhaps Don Miguel had mentioned something to his wife. Perhaps simply the collective intuition had anticipated the inevitable. Fact is that one morning in July, while Aurora selected vegetables at Doña Carmen's stall, the woman looked at her with a knowing smile. "White will suit you well with your skin tone," she commented, while weighing the tomatoes. "Although it's a difficult color for a dress that will be worn in the mountains." Aurora looked at her without understanding. "Pardon?" "Your wedding dress, dear," clarified Doña Carmen, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "The whole town is talking about it. They say it will be an intimate ceremony, just with the closest friends." Aurora felt heat rising to her face. While it was true that she and Matteo had decided to formalize their relationship after that conversation under the stars, after nights of long talks about the future, after deciding that he would accept the scholarship, but with the promise to return whenever possible, they hadn't spoken of marriage. Not yet. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she responded with all the dignity she could muster. "There is no planned wedding." Doña Carmen looked at her skeptically, but didn't insist. However, Aurora felt her eyes fixed on her back as she walked away from the stall and perceived the whispers that followed her across the square. Upon returning to the cabin, she found Matteo working in the garden, expanding the beds to plant more vegetables. The July sun bronzed his skin, and Aurora allowed herself a moment to admire the natural grace with which he moved, the contained strength of his arms, the concentration on his face. "In town they say we're getting married in August," she announced, without preamble, leaving the shopping basket on the porch table. Matteo stopped abruptly, leaning on his hoe. His expression was unreadable. "Oh, really?" he finally responded, and Aurora detected a hint of amusement in his voice. "And how will the wedding be, according to them?" "Intimate, apparently," she continued, playing along. "Just close friends. And according to Doña Carmen, I'll wear a white dress." Matteo approached, taking off his work gloves. His gaze had become more serious, more intense. "And what do you think of all that?" he asked, studying her face. Aurora felt her heart accelerate. Was this the conversation they had been postponing? Here, now, provoked by town gossip. "I think," she began, carefully choosing her words. "I think that white dresses are difficult to keep clean in the mountains." A slow smile spread across Matteo's face. "It's a valid point," he conceded, taking another step closer. "Any other objection?" Aurora felt the air between them charging with an almost palpable electricity. It was terrifying and exciting at the same time, this precipice they were approaching together. "August is too soon," she responded, holding his gaze. "And it would be strange to get married right before you leave for the capital." Matteo nodded slowly, considering her words. "True," he finally said. "It would be more sensible to wait until I return at Christmas, or perhaps until next summer." Or perhaps, Aurora surprised herself with her boldness. "Perhaps we could marry before you leave." But not in August, in September, just before your trip. That way you would have a defined home to return to. Mateo's eyes lit up with a joy so pure that Aurora felt her heart expanding, almost to the point of pain. "Aurora Mendez," he said, taking her hands in his, "are you asking me to marry you?" She let out a nervous laugh, aware of how unusual the situation was. A 25-year-old widow proposing marriage to a young man of 18, spurred by town rumors. And yet it felt right, natural, as if it were the next logical step on the path they had embarked on together. "I suppose I am," she responded, with a sincerity that surprised her. "Although it's not the way I imagined this conversation." Mateo smiled, bringing her hands to his lips to kiss them with reverence. "I imagine you expected something more romantic than a chat about town gossip while I'm covered in dirt," he joked. "The truth," she confessed, "is that I hadn't imagined it at all. After Sebastian, I never thought I would." She couldn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Mateo understood her, as he always did. "I didn't imagine it either," he admitted. "When I lost my family, I thought that part of life, the one about building something of my own, was closed to me." They remained silent for a moment, hands entwined, the afternoon sun creating a golden halo around them. Aurora thought about how far they had come since that stormy night, how two broken souls had found a way to heal together. "So," Mateo finally said with a smile that illuminated his entire face, "we're getting married in September." Aurora nodded, feeling a joy she thought forgotten bubble in her chest. "In September," she confirmed, "and we'll tell Doña Carmen she was right, she just got the month wrong." They laughed together, and Mateo drew her to him in an embrace that promised a shared future, a path they would travel side by side, regardless of the physical distances that might temporarily separate them. The joy of that moment, however, didn't last as long as they expected. The news of their engagement, now official, provoked diverse reactions in town. Some, like Don Miguel and Lucia, sincerely congratulated them. Others, like Doña Carmen, seemed satisfied to have anticipated the inevitable. But there were also critical voices, disapproving whispers, wary looks. Father Vega was the first to openly express his reservations. One afternoon, as Aurora and Mateo were leaving the grocery store, the priest intercepted them in the square. "I've heard rumors about a wedding," he began, in a tone that tried to be kind, but failed to hide his disapproval. "I hoped you would. Come talk to me before making such a hasty decision." Aurora felt Mateo tense beside her. She herself had to make an effort to maintain her composure. "We were going to visit you this week, Father," she responded with a calm she didn't feel, "to formally request the ceremony." The priest studied them attentively, his gaze lingering on the evident contrast between them. Aurora, with her dignity as a respectable widow, Mateo, barely emerging from adolescence, though with a maturity in his eyes that belied his age. "This union concerns me," he finally confessed. "The age difference, the circumstances of your cohabitation, what people will say. And now, with Mateo's scholarship, an immediate separation after the wedding. It doesn't seem the solid foundation for a Christian marriage." Aurora felt indignation growing within her, but it was Mateo who responded, with a firmness that surprised her. "With all due respect, Father," he said, his voice calm but determined, "what grounds our marriage are not external circumstances, but what we feel for each other, and that is more solid than any social convention." Father Vega seemed momentarily disconcerted by the response. When he spoke again, his tone was more cautious. "I understand your feelings, son, but marriage is a sacred institution, not an impulsive decision based on passing emotions." "There is nothing passing about what we feel," intervened Aurora, finding her voice. "We have lived under the same roof for almost a year, Father. We know each other better than many couples who come to the altar after traditional courtships." The priest sighed, like someone facing a battle lost in advance. "If you are determined, I cannot prevent it," he finally conceded. "But I ask you to reflect seriously, and to consider at least postponing the wedding until Mateo's return from the capital. It would give time for waters to calm, and for him to mature a bit more." Aurora felt Mateo's hand seeking hers, a subtle but significant gesture. united. Thus they responded in unison, "We'll think about it, Father." But both knew as they walked away from the square under the priest's gaze that their decision was made. They would marry in September as planned, with or without Father Vega's enthusiastic blessing. What they didn't anticipate was the storm about to break over them, a tempest not of rain and wind but of prejudices and resistance that would test the strength of their newly declared love. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, brought by young Tomas, the postman's son, who climbed panting to the cabin. Aurora received it with curiosity. Few letters. Reached the mountain and offered the boy a glass of fresh lemonade before he undertook the descent. The envelope was thick, of official paper, with a seal that Aurora immediately recognized, that of the Provincial Education Council. She supposed they would be additional documents for Mateo's scholarship, perhaps the academic calendar, or instructions for his arrival in the capital. Mateo had gone down to town early to help Don Miguel with some preparations for the beginning of the school year. Aurora decided to wait for his return to open the letter together. She left it on the kitchen table and continued with her daily chores, feeding the animals, watering the garden, preparing preserves for winter which, although distant, always came too soon to the mountain. It was midday when she heard the hurried gallop of a horse ascending the path, too early for it to be Mateo, too fast to be a casual visitor. She went out to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and recognized Don Miguel mounted on his chestnut mare. The teacher's face, usually affable, showed a concern that made Aurora feel a knot in her stomach. "Aurora," called Don Miguel, dismounting, in haste. "Has a letter from the council arrived?" She nodded, feeling anxiety growing within her. "This morning," she confirmed. "But I haven't opened it. I was waiting for Mateo." Don Miguel breathed deeply as if preparing to deliver bad news. "They've revoked the scholarship," he announced without preamble, or rather, they've conditioned it. Aurora looked at him without understanding. Conditioned it? To what? The teacher seemed uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. "To Mateo not getting married," he finally responded. "At least not to you." The words fell like stones in a calm pond, creating waves of disbelief and then indignation. "How dare they?" Aurora managed to say when she recovered her voice. "By what right?" Director Cifuentes, explained Don Miguel with evident disgust. "He wrote to the council expressing moral concerns about Mateo's situation. He insinuated that he lived in an inappropriate relationship with an older widow, and that this made him questionable as a future educator of young people." Aurora felt her blood boiling in her veins. The pettiness, the hypocrisy, the intrusion into her private life. It was too much. "And the council listened to him?" she asked, incredulous. "Just like that?" Don Miguel nodded sadly. "The council is conservative, Aurora, and the moral reputation of teachers is something they take very seriously. The letter says Mateo can keep the scholarship if he demonstrates appropriate judgment and conduct, which in their language means abandoning me," she completed, feeling a bitter taste in her mouth. "I'm sorry," said Don Miguel with sincere compassion. "It's unfair and cruel. I told Mateo we'll fight this, that I'll write personally to Inspector Montero, that we'll look for other options." "Where is Mateo now?" interrupted Aurora, suddenly concerned about how he might have received the news. "At the school, drafting a response letter to the council," responded Don Miguel. "I've never seen him so determined. He said he would come up as soon as he finished." Aurora thanked him for the information and the warning. When Don Miguel left, promising to do everything possible to reverse the situation, she entered the cabin and sat at the kitchen table, the still closed letter in front of her. She didn't open it. She didn't need to read the exact words to feel their venom. Instead, she let the initial indignation give way to deeper reflection. She thought about Mateo, about his dream of being a teacher like his father, about the natural talent he had with children. She thought about what it would mean for him to give up that opportunity, about the resentment that could grow over the years. When she heard Mateo's horse approaching, she had already made a decision. A painful decision, but one she believed was correct. She waited for him on the porch, watching him dismount and approach with determined steps. His eyes shone with an intensity that Aurora recognized. It was the same look Sebastian had when he decided to face an injustice regardless of the cost. "You already know," he said, stopping in front of her. "Don Miguel told you." Aurora nodded, motioning to the chair next to hers. Mateo sat down, taking her hands in his, a gesture that had become natural between them. "I won't give you up for a scholarship," he declared firmly. "I've written to the council rejecting it. I told them I don't want to be part of an institution that judges a man's character by whom he loves." Aurora felt her heart contracting. Mateo's determination, his passionate defense of what they felt, moved her deeply. And yet, "You can't reject it," she said softly. "It's your dream, Mateo. It's your father's legacy." "You are my dream now," he responded, with an intensity that almost hurt. "The rest can wait. There are other ways to honor my father's legacy." Aurora breathed deeply, preparing for what she had to say. "You must go to the capital, Mateo," she insisted, squeezing his hands. "You must accept the scholarship. And if for that, we must postpone the wedding, we will." Mateo looked at her incredulously. "Are you suggesting we yield to their blackmail?" he asked, releasing her hands. "That we give them reason?" "I'm suggesting we be strategic," she responded, maintaining her calm. "That we don't allow the pettiness of a few to define our future." She rose and walked to the edge of the porch, contemplating the valley that stretched at her feet. When she spoke again, her voice was serene but firm. "For years after losing Sebastian, I locked myself up here. I turned this cabin into my fortress against the world, against pain, against the possibility of feeling again." She turned to look at Mateo. "And then you arrived, and little by little these walls ceased to be a prison and became a home again." Mateo listened in silence, his face reflecting the internal battle he was waging. "I won't allow this mountain to become another kind of prison," she continued. "Not for you, not for us. You will go to the capital, Mateo. You will become the brilliant teacher you are destined to be. And when you return with your degree and your future secured, we will marry. And if the council or anyone else has something to say about it, let them say it then." Mateo stood and approached her, his eyes bright with contained emotion. "And in the meantime," he asked with a broken voice, "what will we be?" Aurora smiled, a smile that contained all the certainty she had found amid the storm. "We will be what we already are," she responded with simplicity. "Two people who have chosen each other, beyond conventions and prejudices. Two souls who have found the way back to life together." Mateo embraced her then, with a strength that spoke of all the feelings words couldn't express. Aurora allowed herself to get lost in that embrace, in the security of his arms, in the warmth of his body against hers. "I'll wait for you," she murmured against his chest. "Be it a year or two or however many it takes, this cabin will be your home, always." And so, on the porch of that cabin that had witnessed so much pain and so much healing, Aurora and Mateo forged a pact that went beyond ceremonies and papers, a commitment based not on what the world expected of them, but on what they had discovered in each other, the possibility of a love that didn't need to justify itself, that existed simply because two broken hearts had found, against all odds, a way to beat together again. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after Mateo's departure. Aurora found it in her mailbox during her weekly visit to town, a simple envelope with her name written in that calligraphy she had learned to recognize. During the months of working together in the library, she waited until returning to the cabin to open it. She sat on the porch in the rocking chair that Mateo had repaired during winter and carefully unfolded the paper, like someone unwrapping a fragile treasure. "Dear Aurora," the letter began, and those 2 simple words were enough for her to feel his presence as if he were speaking in her ear. "The capital is exactly as my father described it, noisy, chaotic, fascinating, and overwhelming in equal parts. The streets are always full of people walking hurriedly toward destinations that seem tremendously important. The buildings are so tall, one has to tilt one's head back to see where they end. And there are bookstores, Aurora, more bookstores than I could visit in a year. The Teachers' College is an imposing grey stone building, with columns at the entrance and endless corridors. My classmates come from all over the province, some even from further away. We are 20 in the class, 18 men and 2 brave women who have had to fight twice as hard to be here. The classes are demanding but fascinating. We study pedagogy, psychology, literature, sciences. Professor Mendoza, who teaches history of education, reminds me a bit of my father. He has the same passion for transmitting not just knowledge, but love for learning. My room in the Resi. Dense is small but comfortable. I have a window that overlooks an inner courtyard with an orange tree. At night, when the city's bustle calms a little, I sit by that window and think of you, of the cabin, of the mountains. I close my eyes and try to listen to the wind among the pines. I imagine the smell of firewood and herbs that always permeates the kitchen. I miss you, Aurora, every day, every hour. But I know I am where I should be, doing what I should do. And I also know that when I return, we will build something beautiful together. With all my love, Matteo. Aurora read the letter 3 times before carefully storing it in her dress pocket. Then she entered the cabin, took out paper and pen and began to write her response. Thus a routine was established that would extend over the coming months. Letters traveling from the mountain to the capital and from the capital to the mountain, carriers of yearnings, confessions, discoveries, promises. Aurora told him about the changes in the cabin, the new bookshelf she had built for the books he sent her, the improvements in the garden, the expansion of the corral, about the town, gossip, Lucia's engagement to the pharmacist's son, the reconciliation between Don Miguel and Director Cifuentes, the new church bells, about her thoughts and feelings as she became accustomed to solitude again. Matteo related his adventures in the capital, his first visit to the theatre, his discovery of the National Library, his walks in the Central Park, his progress in his studies, the classes he most enjoyed, the projects he worked on, the professors who inspired him, his dreams for when he returned, the school they could establish in the cabin for children from distant farms, the innovative methods he was learning and would adapt to the needs of the Sierra. Through these letters, their relationship deepened in a way that perhaps would not have been possible in daily cohabitation. Without the distraction of physical presence, without the everyday life that sometimes blurs feelings, both found themselves obliged to put into words what they carried in their hearts. Sometimes, wrote Aurora in a letter from late October, I wonder if this isn't a kind of blessing in disguise. We have to get to know each other again in a different way. We have to learn to love beyond shared routine, beyond the comfort of immediate presence. We are learning to love the essence of the other, what remains when everything else is stripped away. In November, when cold began to tighten its grip on the Sierra, a special letter arrived. The envelope contained, besides the usual pages filled with Matteo's writing, a small object wrapped in cloth. I found it in an antique shop, explained Matteo. It's a hummingbird carved in malachite, a green mineral that, according to the seller, symbolizes transformation and healing. It reminded me of that wooden bird I carved for you, remember? But this one is more beautiful and lasting, like what we've built together. Aurora held the small figure between her fingers, marveling at the detail of the outstretched wings, at the shine of the green mineral under the lamp's light. She placed it on the mantelpiece, next to the wooden hummingbird that Matteo had carved so many months ago. Together they formed a perfect duo, one rustic and warm, born from Matteo's hands, the other refined and brilliant, chosen by him in his new life. December brought the news both were waiting for. Matteo would come for Christmas vacation. 2 weeks they would spend together in the cabin, reconnecting, sharing in person what the letters could only partially convey. Aurora threw herself into preparations with an energy that surprised even herself. She cleaned every corner of the cabin, prepared preserves and sweets, bought new fabrics to make curtains, planted winter flowers in pots that she strategically placed to give color to the rooms. On the appointed day, she rose before dawn. She put on a dress she had sewn especially for the occasion, a deep blue that, according to Lucia, highlighted the color of her eyes. She gathered her hair in a soft bun, letting some strands frame her face. She even allowed herself a touch of color on her lips, something she hadn't done in years. When she heard the gallop of a horse ascending the path, She felt her heart accelerating, like that of a young girl before her first love. She went out to the porch, breathing deeply to calm the nerves she hadn't expected to feel. What if they had changed too much in these months? What if the connection they had had diluted with distance? All her fears dissipated the instant she saw Matteo dismount and walk toward her. He was different, taller perhaps, or more robust, with his hair a little longer and a new confidence in his step. But his eyes, those eyes that looked at her as if she were the only person in the world, remained the same. "Aurora," he said, simply stopping at the foot of the steps, and in the way he pronounced her name, in the reverence with which he did it, Aurora knew that nothing essential had changed. That distance, far from weakening what they felt, had refined it like fire refines gold. They looked at each other for a moment, absorbing the small changes, recognizing each other beyond them, and then, without either being able to say who took the first step, they were in each other's arms, in an embrace that said everything words couldn't express. "You're here," she murmured against his chest, inhaling his scent, different but familiar, like a known song interpreted with new instruments. "I'm home," he responded, his voice reverberating under Aurora's ear. The 2 weeks that followed were a gift that both savored fully. They shared stories by the fire, walked through the snow-covered mountains, cooked together recipes that Matteo had learned in the capital, read aloud the books he had brought. And at night, when the cabin slept under the starry mantle of the Sierra, winter, they found a new way to communicate, a language of caresses and whispers that transcended conventions and expectations. A love that expressed itself not only in words or promises, but in mutual surrender, in shared vulnerability, in absolute trust. The eve of his departure, sitting on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and in the certainty of what they had confirmed during those days, Matteo took Aurora's hands in his. "When I return in summer," he said with a calm determination, "we will marry. Regardless of what the council, the town, or the entire world says." Aurora nodded, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long time. "When you return," she confirmed, "but not to defy anyone, not to prove anything, simply because it's what we want, what we choose." Matteo smiled, that smile that illuminated his entire face and that Aurora had learned to love deeply. "Do you know what Professor Mendoza told me when I told him about you?" he asked, gently caressing the back of her hand with his thumb. "He said, 'Young Ibarra, there are loves that need no explanation or justification. They are like certain mathematical truths, self-evident.'" Aurora laughed, moved by the academic comparison. "Your professor sounds like a wise man," she commented. "He is," confirmed Matteo. "He also said that life is too short and too precious to let others define our happiness." They remained in silence, contemplating the stars that shone with an impossible clarity in the city. The night's cold enveloped them, but they barely noticed it, protected by the warmth of their closeness, of their confirmed love. "I'll write to you every day," promised Matteo when bedtime approached, "and I'll count every minute until summer." Aurora rested her head on his shoulder, feeling her heart overflowing with an emotion that went beyond joy, beyond love. A deep, serene certainty that she had found her place in the world. And that place wasn't the cabin, or the mountain, or the town. It was beside this man who had arrived at her door in the midst of the storm and had brought spring to her frozen heart. "I'll count too," she responded softly, but not with impatience, rather with gratitude. "Each day that passes is one more day on this path we've chosen to walk together." Summer arrived in the Sierra with an explosion of life and color. The meadows were covered with wildflowers, the trees dressed in their densest foliage, and the air filled with the buzzing of insects and the song of birds returning from their winter migrations. Aurora contemplated this rebirth from the cabin porch while weaving a crown of flowers for her hair. Tomorrow would be the day. After almost 2 years of waiting, of letters, of brief but intense visits, finally she and Matteo would unite in marriage. They had chosen to celebrate the ceremony there, in the cabin, not in the town church. Father Vega had agreed to officiate. In that remote place, more due to Inspector Montero's intervention, now a firm defender of Matteo than from his own conviction, the guests would be few. Don Miguel and his wife, Lucia, and her now husband, Some professors from the college whom Matteo especially appreciated, Isabel and her family. An intimate, simple wedding, exactly as they had imagined from the beginning. Without ostentation, without pretensions, just the sincere celebration of a love that had blossomed against all odds. Matteo had arrived 3 days earlier, radiant with the news that he had completed his studies with honors and TA. He already had offers to teach both in the capital and in the town. "But I've chosen the mountain," he had told Aurora while they dined that first night. "We'll establish that school for children from distant farms, as we discussed. The cabin is big enough, and we can build an additional classroom before winter." Aurora had nodded, excited by the way their individual dreams intertwined and strengthened each other. In these 2 years, she too had grown. She had expanded the garden until turning it into a small business that supplied some families in town. She had passionately resumed reading, devouring the books that Matteo sent her, and writing her own reflections. She had even begun to give classes in practical botany to some women interested in traditional medicine. She was no longer the isolated widow who looked at the world with wariness. She had become a confident woman who had found her purpose not despite her past pain, but thanks to the transformation it had provoked in her. A sound of hooves pulled her from her reflections. A rider was approaching the cabin, and by the way of riding, Aurora recognized Don Miguel. She rose to receive him, surprised by the unexpected visit on the eve of the wedding. "Aurora," greeted the teacher, dismounting with agility. "Forgive the intrusion. Is Matteo here?" "He's gone down to town to pick up some things for tomorrow," she responded, inviting him to sit. "Is something wrong?" Don Miguel seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. He took an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "This arrived at the school today," he explained. "It's from the Ministry of Education. I thought Matteo should see it as soon as possible." Aurora took the envelope with some apprehension. After all they had been through, after Matteo's successful graduation, what could the ministry want now? "Do you know what it contains?" she asked, indicating the still-closed envelope. Don Miguel nodded, a smile finally appearing on his lips. "I opened it. I hope you'll forgive the indiscretion," he confessed. "It's an appointment. They've designated Matteo as inspector of rural schools for the entire Sierra." Aurora looked at him without fully understanding. "Inspector? But he has just finished his studies." "Apparently, his final project on education in remote areas greatly impressed the committee," explained Don Miguel, visibly proud. "And Inspector Montero personally recommended him for the position. It's an extraordinary recognition, Aurora, and it means he'll be able to establish that school he so desires with official support." Joy flooded Aurora's chest. After so many obstacles, after so much resistance, Matteo's talent and passion finally received the recognition they deserved. And the most beautiful thing was that this recognition wouldn't take him away from her, but would strengthen the project they had dreamed of together. "It's wonderful," she said simply, returning the envelope to Don Miguel. "You should give it to him yourself. It will be a perfect wedding gift." The teacher nodded, storing the letter again. "I'll do it tomorrow, during the celebration," he promised. "I wanted you to be prepared, to fully enjoy his reaction." After Don Miguel left, Aurora returned to her flower crown, but her mind now flew in all directions. She thought about how far they had come, the trials they had overcome, the life they were about to begin together. A life that would be different from what she had imagined with Sebastian, but no less full, no less meaningful. The afternoon was beginning to fall when she heard Matteo's horse. She went out to greet him, watching him dismount with that natural grace that always captivated her. He carried full saddlebags and a radiant smile that illuminated his entire face. "Mission accomplished," he announced, showing her a small box. "The rings are ready. The goldsmith did magnificent work." Aurora took the box and opened it carefully. Inside, on a bed of blue velvet, rested 2 simple but elegant rings, with a motif of leaves engraved in the metal. "They're perfect," she murmured, feeling a knot of emotion in her throat. Matteo approached and surrounded her with his arms, resting his chin on her head. "Tomorrow at this time," he said softly, "you'll be my wife." Aurora turned in his arms to look into his eyes. "I already am in everything that matters," she responded. Tomorrow we'll just make it official for the world. They dined on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They talked about the final preparations, about the guests who would arrive in the morning, about the food they had arranged for the celebration. "There's something I want to show you," said Aurora when they finished dining. "A gift. For us." She took Matteo's hand and guided him to the room that 2 years earlier they had cleaned together. The room that Sebastian had prepared for the child who was never born. The door was closed, as always, but this time Aurora opened it without hesitation. The chamber had been transformed. It was no longer the children's room that Matteo remembered, with the cradle as the central element. Now it was a bright space with bookshelves full of books, a large desk under the window, and in the center a simple upright piano. "How?" began Matteo, surprised. "Don Miguel helped me bring it," explained Aurora. "It comes from Lucia's grandparents' house, who no longer used it. I thought it would be perfect for the school, for children to learn music as you learned." Matteo approached the instrument, passing his fingers over the keys with reverence. "It's a wonderful gift," he said, visibly moved, "not just for the school but for us, for our home." He sat on the small bench and began to play a soft, nostalgic melody. Aurora recognized the song. It was the same one he had played on the guitar that first night, when she had finally cried for Sebastian's death. "This room has completed its transformation," commented Aurora, leaning on the doorframe. "From a space of mourning to a place of possibilities, from a painful memory to a promise of future." Matteo stopped playing and looked at her with an intensity that still, after all this time, made her tremble. "Like us," he responded simply, and in those 2 words was contained their entire story. The pain both had experienced, the encounter that had changed their lives, the path they had traveled together toward healing and hope. Aurora approached and sat beside him on the bench. Matteo resumed the melody, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the music vibrate through both of them, connecting them at a level that went beyond words. Outside, night had completely fallen over the Sierra. The stars shone with a clarity only found in the heights, far from the lights and bustle of the world. The cabin, which had once been refuge and fortress, now prepared to become something more, a home where love and learning would flourish together, where the past would not be denied, but honored as part of the path that had led them here. Tomorrow would be their wedding. Tomorrow would officially begin the new chapter of their lives. But in reality, thought Aurora as Matteo's music enveloped them like a blessing, that chapter had begun that stormy night, when she opened her door to a stranger and, without knowing, it also opened her heart to the possibility of loving again. The piano continued to sound in the Sierra night, its notes rising toward the starry sky like a prayer of gratitude, like a hymn to the resilience of the human heart, that, even in its darkest moments, finds a way to be reborn when least expected.